Check, 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 check. Hello everyone, if you could please make sure there are no seats between each other. This is going to be a full house, so if there are spare seats, please move down. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name's Sarah Renchev-Hale, and I'm head of the Imperial Enterprise Lab. Very happy to see so many of you here, and well done for getting a seat. There's quite a few people outside who are still trying to get in, so well done for being on time. I am really delighted to see you here, and we've got an amazing event for you today, which sold out in absolute record time. So I'm going to tell you a little tiny bit about the Enterprise Lab, and then I'm going to hand over to the main event. So for those of you who don't know, we are Imperial College's Centre for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and we support students, alumni, staff, all of the Imperial community in coming up with new ideas, launching and scaling new ventures. So if you're interested in finding out more, please go to our website, and we'd love to hear from you or see you down in the Enterprise Lab. I just want to say one last thing, which is a huge thank you to Kyriakos, who you'll hear from later, who is an Imperial alum from the Masters in Management program, I believe. So one of our own back here today to tell us about his amazing career so far and a huge supporter of the work that we do. So I'm going to hand over to Vanessa. Please welcome Vanessa.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today and for listening in. Thanks for having me as well. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. So I'm Vanessa. I'm a product engineer at Terra API. And what I do is I speak to users, I try to understand users, I observe them, and then I try to get back to my team and align on what shall we build next, and how do we really make sure that whatever we're building, whatever we're putting out there in the world is irresistible. So I'm very excited to be speaking about something that at first might seem a little bit obvious, but it's actually really hard to get right. It's truly understanding your users. So I've been a design researcher before. I worked hand in hand with clinicians, patients, nurses, to identify, okay, what do they need and how do we make this come to life? And it's actually not as easy as it sounds. Why is it important to truly understand your users? Unless you only want to sell to yourself, you actually have to get out there and make sure what you're building is going into the right direction. Now, quick reality check. We as humans, we're kind of naturally just biased, right? It's how our brain is wired. And especially as a founder, as someone who is trying to build irresistible products, you have to double check yourself. And you might think, I'm a super empathetic person. I can put myself into the shoes of a user. I am that person who understands users. It's actually impossible. So today, I want to speak about mainly three things. I want to speak about whether it's possible to become your own user and draw learnings from that. I want to speak about why it's super important to be extremely obsessed with just one user. And I want to speak about why you should never listen to your users. So let me go to the next slide, and let's get started. I want to start with brain science, because why not? Everyone loves brain science. Why are we so biased to begin with? Why is it difficult for us as humans to really put ourselves into the shoes of someone else and try to understand things from their standpoint? So there is a region in the brain called the default mode network. It's a region in the brain that is active when, let's say, you're daydreaming, when you're zoning out, when you're not really focused on one specific task. So you can imagine that happens quite often throughout the day. And what really happens is introspection. So that part of your brain actually draws from all your memories, your learnings, your experiences throughout the time, and it makes sense from that information without you having any control over it. And it sounds useful, right? Because what happens is when you have to make decisions, fast and you need judgment, it's kind of like a mental shortcut. It allows you to draw from your memories and experiences and make those decisions. But there's also a downside to it, because it means it's something that you cannot unlearn. You cannot just toggle it off. Even if you try to emphasize with your users, it's almost impossible to turn it off completely. So this is how our brains are wired. And then I remember I was asking myself, is it really impossible to become your own user? Because becoming your own user has so many benefits, right? It means you can draw from your own learnings, you can experiment faster, you kind of develop that product sense that you can trust, and you develop that gut instinct that leads your decisions. So here's something interesting that happened at Terra. A couple of months ago, I was looking at data. I was looking at some metrics that we track from our platform. So we are a developer tool. We enable developers and companies to connect whatever wearable sensor, app, blood report to their app. So they get the data from us, powered through to their app. So I looked at the onboarding metrics. I was looking at, well, why does it take users longer than expected to get onboarded and get started with our product? And I think your first intuition is to try to make sense of that data, and you start with a lot of assumptions. You look at the data from different angles, and you try to question whether it's significant. Is there enough data to even draw conclusions? And the main point is, if you just look at quantitative data, there is no context. It's guesswork. There is no nuance into that. So then the next thing I was thinking is, well, obviously I need to speak to users to understand what's going on. How can we, speed up the process of them onboarding? But is there anything else we can do? And the next thing that happened was we made it our goal that every single new hire at Terra API is becoming our super user. Well, the benefit, I think, is quite obvious, because first of all, it's someone that you literally hired to do the job, so you can ask them as many questions as you want. But also, it's interesting because they have no idea, or not enough idea, of how your product is intended to work. So they're like a sponge. They're like a user who's never seen your product before. So what happened is, every new hire, the first day they join Terra, they don't get a demo of what we're doing. We don't tell them, hey, here's the presentation, this is how the product is intended to work, here are all the details, all the slides, whatnot. The first thing they get to do is actually a task, which is use our product, and you don't get help. And that's not just for developers, by the way, right? So we had this scenario where a new designer was joining. He's actually here in the room today, and he went through the same task as well. So we tell them, okay, here, sign up, observe everything you're doing, and tell me every single friction point. Try to connect different wearables, sensors to your app and make sense of that data. And bear in mind that person has never really fully used our product. And we sit next to them, and we don't help them. So their first onboarding task, essentially, is actually a real-life user testing. We sit next to them, and the benefit here is you get into the details, into the nitty-gritty. You can see every single click. You can see every single page swipe. And more interestingly, you see when they switch to Google or they switch to ChatGPT and they start typing in different questions when they get lost. And you might think, well, what am I going to do with all that detail, right? If I want to build a great product, why would I care about these little things? Why would I care about clicks? In reality, I believe personally innovation and opportunities are found in small and mundane things at times. Right? If you notice that someone has to do a lot of extra work just to get where they want to get to, that could be something you can automate. That could be something that could be more seamless. So doing this exercise with every single new hire actually gets us an ultra-high resolution of how our product is actually working. And I find that really interesting because you might think, well, I can do the same with my other users, customers. But trust me, there are very little users and customers out there who are willing to debrief with you for 4 hours, right? Their time is limited, and they might not pay attention to those small little details. But if you can sit next to them, and if you can debrief with them afterwards, you get that high resolution image of your product. Second benefit, well, I was talking about how we as humans are super biased, right? Even if we try, it's kind of tricky. But if you start off with that exercise, my belief is that you kind of prime your brain into thinking, this is how I initially felt as a customer, as a user. So every new hire that starts at Terra, even throughout the time, we hope that they remember this feeling of being a first-time user and to be very observant of small details. So that's the first thing. Become your own user. Well, obviously, you cannot just rely on your new hires to wait for inspiration and to uncover product opportunities. So at some point, yes, you do need to speak to users. Now, something that I personally find very interesting is if you have the problem of, okay, where do I go next? What product shall I build? What feature shall I build next? The general advice out there seems to be, okay, look at the market, look at the industry, try to identify the biggest chunk of the pie, essentially. Speak to different stakeholders, speak to different personas, and just have kind of like a bird's eye view on the things to identify that you're really, looking at the right opportunities to catch. And I think one of the most counterintuitive things we did at Terra API is just to do the opposite. Right? So we kind of disregarded that part. And I'll give you an example. A couple of months ago, we were breaking into a new market segment. And we did the opposite. We became super obsessed about just one person. So we didn't look at 10 different stakeholders, and we looked at all the potential buyers that would be interested in our product. We studied one person in detail. I almost want to say we stalked them. So what happened was we narrowed down the criteria. We were very, very selective in terms of who shall we study to identify what we should build next, how we should do our messaging, and how should we put the product out into the world. So we studied that person because we were very confident, based on these criteria, very selective criteria, that whoever is targeted by what we put out there is matching that person, and they will be interested in us as well. So what did we do practically? We dissected every single piece of information we got from that person. So first of all, we were confident they were the right fit because they already paid for us. They were from the right niche market segment that we wanted to target, and they kept using our product, right? So that's how we knew. Then we looked at all the call transcripts. We analyzed the call transcripts. We went through the emails. We went through the messages. We stalked them on social media. We went through their likes, their comments, their reposts, their reshares, what articles they consume, and we look at the language they speak. So we looked at, okay, what words do they use? How do they present themselves? And what might they also do outside of work? And for someone who's trying to break into a new market, you might say, why are you doing all this? And also, are you not taking a lot of losses? Are you not ignoring other opportunities? Because there are other potential buyers out there. The thing that I think we got from this is speed and alignment, right? Because we only focus on one particular user. It was so easy for the entire team to get momentum. Every single person knew that was the person we're going to study. So everyone was kind of going to the same direction. And our messaging, our product, what we built, it was basically not diluted at all because we didn't have to compromise. There was not a second opinion from a second person that we had to take into account as well. So that was the first thing. There was a lot of alignment. And then if you think about that, if you just have to study one person in detail, you don't have to spend weeks on it, right? You basically just have one laser focus. And what happens is you act very quick on that data that you get. So you're able to bring out a product, a marketing website, messaging that is laser focused in minimum amount of time. And that speeds up your learning as well. So you will know right away whether what you've put out there actually works. And chances are, even though you've built this product for just one person, there are at least 5 to 10 to 20 people out there who quite resonate with it as well. And then it accelerates your entire learning process through multiple iterations. So that's kind of what we did when we broke into the new market. Now, the other thing that I want to speak about finally is, all that put aside, how do you actually speak to users, like practically? How do you get to the core of the things, right? Like how do you make sure they actually tell you what they need, or how do you identify that? And then why shouldn't you listen to them in the end? So that one is quite an interesting one. Probably also one of the more counterintuitive things that we do at Terra. And I remember when I first joined Terra, I saw a lot of requests coming in from customers. And those requests were quite interesting. So the basic messaging was, hey, please update your documentation. It's not updated. It's outdated, right? Very straightforward. I think a lot of developer tools might have this issue. So that was months ago, and the first thing we did was, well, that's such an obvious request. We're going to drill down into it straight away. So we went in our documentation, we looked at the different sections, we started dissecting it, we started thinking, okay, this needs updating, here we need to place an exclamation mark, here we should, make an out call. No one should pass this section without seeing it. So we were completely stuck with documentation. And to be honest, it makes sense, right? If you're a developer, the first thing you think of is, well, the docs are outdated, obviously you need to update them. I don't think anyone would really question that user request. It's kind of natural. But there is a thing that you miss out if you just go into that route. So the thing is, we didn't really question why did they have to read the documentation to begin with. And I agree, they're developers. Yes, it makes sense. But what was the underlying issue here, right? So when we then started inquiring, what was your actual goal? What did you do? Why did you have to go into the documentation? There was a little bit more insight here. And the point is, it can feel almost funny to repeatedly ask your users why. Why is that a problem to you? Because at some point, they're just like, well, it doesn't work, that's why. And it's quite, I would say, it's quite an art to lead the conversation in a way that opens up other avenues, that makes the conversation even more personal and almost vulnerable, because you want to understand, why are they getting angry? What were they trying to solve? And it turns out for that user in particular, well, what they did was they were trying to implement something in their backend. It didn't work as expected, and now they were confused whether it was their issue, whether it was them who did a mistake, or whether it was us. So then, because it wasn't obvious from our product itself what was going on, they were trying to take the other route and go into the instructions, go into the documentations, and try to find that information. So repeatedly asking why, and I usually say you have to ask at least 3 times why to get to the core problem, can feel a little bit unfamiliar, but it's really, really helpful. And to summarize some of my learnings in the past years, but especially at Terra, I think when you speak to users with the goal to understand, how do I make my product irresistible? What shall I build next? There are 3 general tips, or 3 things that I personally think of. The first one being, never ask your users about opinions. Don't ask them, how do you like it? What do you think about this feature? Do you think you will use this feature in the future? It's the most obvious route to take, because you expect direct answers. But those answers are super vague, and they're not grounded in any facts. So what you want to do instead is you want to ask them something where they can't lie about, right? Something that gives you a robust answer. For example, instead you could ask, okay, in the last 7 days, tell me on which day you were working the longest, and tell me exactly what you were doing that day. Like, what were the main tasks that you did, and how much time do you spend on each task? And what was the most annoying thing about that task? So you really want to understand how they walk through life and how they walk through work, in case it's in a B2B context. And then you'll understand their opinions. Now, the second thing is, don't accept vagueness. I've mentioned it before, but don't accept vagueness, right? Let's say you have a new product idea and you want to validate whether it's solving an actual problem that your users are facing. And they might say something like, yes, it's definitely a big problem. It's definitely something I'm struggling with, and I would love a solution for that. Again, it's an opinion, kind of, and you want to take it back to some grounded answers, right? You might want to ask them, okay, if it's such a big problem, have you ever looked for a solution? Have you ever tried to solve your problem, actually? And what makes that problem so dramatic for you? And then lastly, never ask hypothetical questions, right? All the woulds. Would you buy my product if it was a little bit cheaper? Would you buy my product if there were more features? Would you buy my product if this? You kind of want to avoid that situation, because you kind of force your users to take on your work, which is identifying the opportunities. They're really good at describing what they do throughout their lives, throughout their work. But it's really difficult for them within 1 minute to give you an answer that they have thoroughly analyzed. And it's generally probably better to just observe them and ask them which tasks they were doing at what time and how much effort they had to spend on these things. So to summarize, and I'll leave you with that, each struggle of your user, I believe, is not really a complaint, it's actually a clue. And it's an opportunity for you to innovate. So observe the little things, observe the mundane things, and take it from the details. Thank you for listening. So I'm going to hand over to Matt and Kyriakos. Oh yeah, you might take this mic as well.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. Huh?
Likewise. Nice to meet you all.
Okay, guys, I'm Kyriakos. I'm the CEO of Terra. A few years ago, I was studying here, and one of the problems I faced was there was not a lot of mentorship when it comes to startups. So there was a lot of information that I couldn't find from the startup ecosystem. So a few years later, Matt is one of the best in the world at that, so thanks for joining. For our introduction, Matt studied at Oxford, I believe, at the beginning. Yeah. Then launched a company called GoCardless, which is a $1 billion company right now. Also launched Nested, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, very well known in the UK too. And then now is a partner in Accel, probably, if not the best fund in the world. So, welcome.
Nice to be here. One question. Is this public that's being recorded? I will moderate.
I think it's public. I think it's live.
Okay, fine. Yeah. I'll be slightly careful.
Maybe should we stop it?
You won't get the... No, it's fine. You just won't get the best gossip.
Awesome. So, let's go a bit back. How did you start the company? How did you start GoCardless at the beginning?
So I'd always loved kind of businesses, and I'd always built stuff and loved solving problems ever since I was a kid. Even at school, I was part of a business that we built, and I find often lots of it's not everyone, but lots of entrepreneurs you talk to, like you just go back in their history and you'll find something. It doesn't have to be a business. It might just be they started an alternative tuck shop at school, or they were selling, cards and making money or whatever. Everyone just, you find this little entrepreneurial spark, and I always had that. I was always doing things like that, and the fascination was always with solving problems, especially problems that other people didn't think could be solved. And then to the question on GoCardless, I think I met some amazing people. So after university, I left and worked at a place called McKinsey. I knew I wanted to go and build a business, but I felt, or luckily enough, I was just about smart enough to figure out that maybe I could learn something from other people along the way that might help me build a bigger, better business that I think was a worthwhile endeavor. But whilst there, I knew I wanted to go and start something. I found some amazing people I wanted to start something with. And I think that's for me, the key. I found some people I wanted to start something with. And actually, there's different ways of starting companies, but in all honesty, we were more in love with the idea of starting and building a great company than solving that particular problem.
I think in general perception in Imperial was that everyone needs to join McKinsey before starting a business. What do you think?
I disagree. Any rule like that is probably not true. I think the thing for me is just figuring out what you need to get where you're going, but not. I really dislike these paths of stepping stones. I really dislike. I know I want to go and do that, and therefore I'm going to go and do like this along the way to get there. And I always just really fearful that you figure out along that path that you never wanted to get to that thing in the end. It's like you wasted all that time doing other things to get there. So I had a friend funnily enough, he got in touch with me when I just started GoCardless, and he thought he wanted to go become a consultant, and he said, hey, someone from school said that you'd worked at McKinsey. I wanted to chat to you about getting into consultancy. I really want to go and do consultancy because I'd like to go and start a business. And I said, well, it was a fantastic experience for me. I learned a ton, met some amazing people. But if I wanted to go and start a business, that is probably not the thing that I would necessarily do. If you want to go start a business, again, I think about the things you need. For me, it was great because I needed to prove and learn a work ethic. I needed to build a network. I needed some kind of concrete skills because I had none. And that was perfect for that point in my career. But for him, actually, he had many of those things already. The two most interesting things for him to do, one was either to go and join a business and learn what one might look like, a growth business. And he went and joined a fab company called Skyscanner, had an amazing experience there. And the second one was, he was ready. He could have gone and started something. So I think the key is really to think about actually what are the things you want in life, like what do you need, and then go get them.
And how did you meet your co-founders?
Met Hiroki at McKinsey, so we worked together. And that is a great thing about working in talent hubs or studying in talent hubs. Funnily enough, our first conversation was at a welcome dinner before joining, where we had an argument about whether you needed co-founders or not to start a business. Let's say
What's the answer there?
He won that argument, but it's the only one since. Again, I think it really depends on the business you're building, but for me, you definitely want co-founders. When I think about the stuff I care about in life, fun, learning, and impact, I've been really fortunate to have some amazing co-founders in the business I've built, and I've had the most fun when I've been working with those guys. All the terrible things that happened felt a lot less bad as well when I had those guys around. I learned the most probably from them and with them and because they were there, and had the most impact again when we were working together. So I think they're just an accelerant for being successful. But you did YC. I think YC has a great rule on this, which is, 2 or 3 great two or three great co-founders is great, but actually like one co-founder is better than 2 bad co-founders. So if it's not going to stick together, if it's not going to work, then you shouldn't try and force it.
And on that, it's a small parenthesis. How would you advise people to find co-founders?
Tough question. I'm contrarian on a lot of things, so you should be careful about what you listen to from me, but hopefully it's like an interesting data point. I really dislike networking. I hate going to an event with 200 people and chatting to them for 30 seconds each, and I just find that really superficial and not very meaningful or valuable. What I love is leaning into real relationships. So for many people, when they want to look for co-founders, and again, it really depends on you. Everything is on you and how you operate and where you get your energy from and how you work. But for me, that doesn't work. So for me, going and get co-founders, it was just unfathomable that I would go and meet someone that I'd never worked with before and then start working with them in such a deep way. For other people, that's worked incredibly well. So I took a really simple process. People I work with, again, simple rules. I look for people I trust, people I like, and people I respect or I rate. There's a deliberate order there because there's nothing more dangerous than someone who's really smart but you can't trust. And I just looked at my network and I went through all the people I knew, and I went through and made a list of, okay, who do I know that I trust, I like, and that I respect, and like deeply on each of those axes. And again, I'm contrarian. I like that approach leads you to a very short list. I had probably 3 people. I was like, great, I'm just going to go and spend more time with these people and talk to them and figure out where they're at. And if the timing is right, then we go make something happen. And both times that worked out fantastically well for me. But again, that's an approach. Other people will have different approaches.
And can you give us some context? How were the first 3 months in GoCardless?
God, this is a long time ago. The best summary I can give is we didn't know what the hell we were doing. Like, honestly, if you took the things that you should do in order to build a business and be successful, then we probably did the absolute opposite. We were running around. I remember one thing we did. We had so much fun, though, I should be clear, and that's really important. But one of the things we did in the first few months was we went, for some unknown reason, decided we needed more manpower. So we went back to Oxford for like a week and interviewed a ton of interns. We hired like an army of interns. We hired like 8 interns to come and work with us over the course of the summer, and they were all exceptional. And actually, it turns out we were quite good at hiring because they've all gone on to do like fantastic things. But it meant that we were now spending all of our time managing the interns as opposed to doing the things that we should actually be doing to build a business. And some funny stories at the time. We rented like a small house for them. I think there were 8 of them, and we could only get a place with like 6 bedrooms. So we didn't end up telling them there were only 6 bedrooms. And it was when we got there with the 8, we're like, "Hi guys, drop you off here." And I don't know what happened when the moment they realized, okay, there's only 6 bedrooms here. And then they come into our house every day, and we had so much fun. It was an amazing time, but we got in trouble because we were living in a flat and we were working out of our flat, and we had these like 8, well, there must be like 10 of us or 11 of us in this house every day. And they obviously figured out that we were running some kind of business out there, which was in breach of our tenancy. And the guy came and said, "Hey, you know, we were going to be in big trouble, you know, da da da." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're obviously running a business out there. You got all these people on laptops in there all day." I said, "What are you talking about? We just really like mass multiplayer online games. Like, we're in there gaming all day." And we obviously looked nerdy enough that could plausibly be true. So we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And this is the advantage, actually, of going and working in a startup with great people as you learn what it should look like. We were building a startup blind. We'd never seen a startup. We didn't even know what it should look like. And there's advantage to that. Naivety is a beautiful strength. We had this vision of nirvana from what we'd read about the companies in San Francisco and what they looked like and how they operated. And there's probably some dissonance between what we read in the books and how we imagined it, but that's kind of what we were building. But what I would say we did get right is we were ambitious. And we prioritized the thing that we felt mattered. At that time, we felt like we were a product-first organization. We felt like if you found a problem and you built the best product and continue to invest in that, and actually the way to build the best product is to build the best product team, then you could be successful in the long run. And that, at the time, was when, we won't even remember this, but that was at a time when engineering and product were kind of second-class citizens. They were like IT. They were the guys in the cupboard who did stuff for you. And actually, we had this different approach where we prioritized those things. And that even started with the interns we hired. They were all technical and smart and more product-oriented. And that was something that transpired, even though there were missteps along the way. If you get those core instincts right, then over the long run, they can take you to good places.
How early did you join YC? And as a separate question, should one join YC? And also, maybe, should you raise money early as well?
Ooh. 3 questions. And you know what, I had 4, because I had the last one. You said, what were we doing in the first 3 months? I think this is interesting, because maybe if anyone is thinking about starting something, the first thing we did was we had to come up with an idea, because we didn't have one. We were people first as opposed to idea first. And initially it was Hiroki and myself. So we were coming up with ideas, and we spent like a couple of weeks coming up with ideas and being really creative and thoughtful. And then we'd set aside a day to kind of prosecute each of these ideas. And our main learning at that point was, you know, there's no idea that 2 smart people can't tear apart in a day. You know, we came up with some businesses. We came up with the idea for, and I'm not claiming credit because we didn't build it, and sure we couldn't have built it, but we came up with an idea loosely that was Funding Circle, one that was Eleftheriou, you know, various other ideas that have gone on to be really successful businesses. But we just, you know, you look at anything hard enough, you tear it apart. And I think an interesting insight from that was, actually, it's not about the 999 reasons why it might not work. It always comes down to like the 1 or 2 reasons why it might work, and they have to be incredibly powerful, like core insights that drive everything else. Like, if I'm right about this one thing, then everything else will fall into place. So that I think is like what you should be focusing on when you start a business, like finding a core insight that if you're right on, then there's real value there. And then to your...
Before you go to that question, like a lot of people are either choosing one idea and they are not flexible at all. And then on the other side there is what we call pivot hell, that people are changing the idea all the times. So how do you know when to choose and which one to go for?
Which approach or which idea?
Which idea to go with?
You don't. It's really tough, and it's almost impossible to know up front. It's kind of an irrational endeavor, right? You believe that with less resource in every sense, less money, less people, less credibility, less experience, less everything, you're going to go and beat all these businesses, you know, at something particular. So it's kind of irrational from the get-go. To expect a rational answer, that this is clearly going to be right, is very, very difficult. The way I would think about it more is you want to find, I think, kind of founder market or founder idea fit of genuinely you want to do something where you're incredibly well placed to do it. If you can't think of a good reason why you should be doing it and others can't, then that's a bad signal. And I think it's exponentially harder for you to be successful at that thing. And the same, you want to have kind of, we call it product market fit or insight market fit. You want to see a problem or have an insight that you really do believe like there's real value in. And the reality is when you're building a business, ultimately a big part of it is you're trying to create economic value, and you can only capture, the amount of value you can capture is a derivative of the amount of value you create. And that will come down to the core insight of what you're building and the market you're in. So therefore, I would think about, okay, what's a market that we're really excited about, we find really interesting, we think we're really knowledgeable on, and related to the previous presentation, it's amazing if you're your own customer, because suddenly you have a real wealth of insight. We started a payments company initially with small businesses. None of us had ever really run a small business of that type that was collecting payments. We had no clue. And again, there's your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. Like, yeah, we had no clue, so that was a massive weakness. But at the same time, it meant we had like a blank piece of paper, and we were so willing to listen to customers and really build. And then to your point of like, how do you know? Ultimately, it's going to come down to, you do all the work, right? You should be analytical or take the approach you take to get to like really good answers. But ultimately, I find, and maybe you had the same with Terra, like of all the ideas you look at, there'll be something where you just like in your stomach or somewhere you're like, I've got to do this. And it's the most, I heard someone say this a while back, and I thought it was such a trite, cliched thing. Like, I can't believe you said that. But they were right, which is the time to start a business is when you can't not start a business. And I mean that in both the macro and the micro sense. The micro sense is you've got this idea that you just can't get out of your system. I think sometimes it's quite healthy to try and get it out of your system and say, okay, like, I'm going to write that down, I'm going to get it out of my head, I'm going to leave it, and I'm going to step away and do whatever. And if you just keep coming back to it, then at some point you've got to do it. And I think there's a psychological beauty to that as well, which is like once you know that you've got to do it, you know you can't leave that thing alone, then, well, it wasn't even a choice. So if it doesn't work out, it's like, well, I had to do it. So, it was never an option that I didn't. So that's where I get to. But my last point would be I would have an incredibly high bar. Building business is an amazing endeavor. I think you should do it. The experience is amazing. You've got to remember the vast majority of people fail, especially when we're talking about venture outcomes. You want to build $1 billion business, like the vast majority of people fail. Those that do not, probably the biggest factor is luck, like, honestly. So this is a huge risk. And I'm looking at this room here, and there's a ton of incredibly smart people here. And depending on what you want to achieve in life, whether that's experiences, learning, again, I go back to fun, learning, and impact. But if we be a little bit crude and go to economic terms, probably, no, definitely the median and the modal outcome, if we took you guys in terms of earnings and returns, would be better if you did not go and build a startup, because there'll be tons of corporates who want you to do stuff. The expected value is slightly different because the outliers are so remunerative that they skew the results. And that's why it takes me away from just that crudely economic sense. There has to be the other side of the psychological need to do it and the desire to learn and the desire to have that experience, such that even if you did it and you failed, it would have been a worthwhile endeavor irrespective.
And back to the timeline, when did you go to YC? What was your experience there?
We went summer 2011. We had a fantastic experience.
Paul Graham and Sam Altman at the time?
Yeah, our two advisors were Paul Graham and Sam Altman, which we didn't know how lucky we were at the time. I think it was relatively early, but not super early. I can't remember. Maybe they started in 2007. So there was certainly a number of UK companies that had gone before us that were kind of our forebears. So Ian Hogarth and I think Pete from Songkick had already gone. Kulvir and Hadj is still there, had gone like really early. These guys were so out there on the curve of hearing about this thing, and it was an amazing experience because it really was a different path for us. We, from the get-go, saw ourselves as our competition of the founders and the companies in San Francisco. Even though we came back to build here, that was the ethos of how we wanted to build businesses and the people we wanted to kind of match ourselves against. And that really, marked us out as incredibly different to the companies over here. I bumped into, funnily enough, last year, I bumped into a founder who built a really successful company, a fintech company in the UK. And it was like a bar somewhere in Europe, and he was like, oh, I've never met, like really fun to meet. And he's like, we used to come after you, and we looked at you and we're like, how the hell did those guys get that valuation? We think our business is as good as theirs, and we're getting this valuation, and we really like used you as a motivation to get on. And I just didn't mean to be nasty, but I was like, it's so funny because we looked at Stripe. That's who we saw as our competition. That's who we were going after. Like we were only ever looking at San Francisco. We were only ever looking at the best companies in the world. That's who we marked ourselves against. That's who we wanted to try and compete with in terms of the amazing things they did. Not just the business outcomes, but the way they thought about talent, the way they thought about hiring, the way they thought about developing people. Like all of those things. Like that was how we did it. And going to YC was like a symptom of that, and then also something that pushed that. And then the last thing I'd say is, YC was different then. Like, you couldn't really raise money as really young founders, especially young technical talent, couldn't really raise money, especially in somewhere like London. And then you had these people who were espousing a different way of building businesses, which is founder first, engineering first, product first, back smart technical talent to go and build really interesting things, where everyone else in the world was still, at the time, the VC ecosystem in Europe was still not far beyond. In many places, there was still some, there were some fantastic investors. Axel, as you said, is great. They've been around for now 25 years in Europe, but the like modal or median VC was still like would ask you for like a business, a 5-year business plan at that point. And it was kind of the catch-20. I called it the catch-22 business plan because if you put something in front of them that was credible, then they tell you it wasn't ambitious enough. And if you put something in front of them that was ambitious, they tell you it wasn't credible. What am I supposed to do? What's the investable plan? Just tell me what that is and I'll give that to you. And there were very few investors, and we were lucky that we found YC. We also found Axel, who invested us at Seed, and a couple of other great investors from the ecosystem that supported us. And to your question of should you raise money really early, I think it really depends on the path for the business. One of the things I always think you should try and do is think about what are we trying to achieve here? Like I said, what are the things we care, what are the things we want to, what's the path? And I would say there is a big difference between the VC path, which is, we're shooting for these mega outcomes, and then more of the bootstrap path. And I think it's quite important that you're honest with yourself at the beginning as to which of those you want to do and what your reasons for building the business are. There's a great book on this. I think it's like No Wasserman, which is called like Rich or King. Do you want to be rich or king? Which basically you can either be king, have control of the empire, but you do that typically by retaining control, not sharing ownership, not necessarily taking investment and having others come in, not giving away equity to other people to come into the business. Or you can be rich, which is in a broader sense, which is you can try and build the biggest possible thing, and that means giving away some to investors to give you some cash, giving away to get amazing co-founders, giving away to get fantastic employees who can all come in and hopefully help you build something, much more successful and much more powerful. And the assumption is most people think that you can just do both, and actually you can't. The very fact that you have so few Jeff Bezoses and Mark Zuckerbergs is that managed to be rich and king. They're like the exceptions that prove the rule. I think that's an interesting thing for you to start before. It's like, do you want to be rich or do you want to be king? And rich is not in the economic sense. It's in the like, how big is the ambition here? And if that's the goal, then I think you should absolutely raise early. If it's not, then I'll be really thoughtful about that path, because once you start raising and bringing in other people, you'll need to make sure that you're all aligned with them in terms of the outcomes that you want to achieve. And then in terms of when to bring in capital, I think the big thing for me is before you take money from other people, you really need to know that you're in this for the long haul. And part of that is I've always felt an obligation that if I've taken someone's money, then I need to deliver on that. I need to show loyalty and really work my arse off to do the things I told them I would. But actually, even taking a step before that, your biggest and most precious resource in this life is your time. That's all we have. That's all any of us ultimately have. And once you take money, you are committed to doing this thing for a potentially, 14 years later, GoCardless is still going for a long period of time, if it goes well. And I think that's the bit that I would need to be convinced. You need to be really convinced that there is something that deserves to be built. And that's the bar that I use when I'm thinking about starting something. It's like, okay, is there a product or a business here that I think needs to be built. This needs to exist in the world. And if not, perhaps that's not something you should be doing.
What mistakes have you done in the first fundraising that you've done, and how did you change your approach over the years?
In terms of investing?
In terms of raising for your company before you become an investor?
And then what was, just remind me, what was the first bit of the question?
What mistakes have you done when you raised at the beginning?
All of them. There's many, but I'll start with a couple of kind of meta ones. The first one is probably just not understanding how VC worked as an industry. I think that's a useful thing that's worthwhile for everyone to understand, which is once you understand that people are looking for power law returns, so, you know, in order to, typically a VC, we'll use some very crude numbers, would, you know, a good VC would want to 3x their fund. That would be over the course of, you know, 10 to 15 years. Let's say they had a 300 million fund. They would invest half of that in first checks, another half in follow-on. They'll make 30 investments. You can run through the math, but in order to get 3x, especially after fees, etc., you know, you have to quadruple your money. The vast majority of the returns will come from the top performing company, and if that one will normally return the fund, and then the second, and then the third. Once you understand that, you understand that actually it's not a rational business. You know, it's kind of a high beta business where you could have someone who's great and you think they're really good and they're doing something that's going to be successful and do really well, but the return profile on that business could never be an outlier, and therefore you would not invest. And you could have a second person who's a bit crazy, maybe a little bit all over the place. You don't know if you can believe what they're saying, but if they're right, it could be phenomenal. And that person will be disproportionately more likely to raise money. And I think that was something that I didn't understand in the beginning. And I'd see smart people with sensible ideas, etc., unable to get funding. And then people that I thought were not credible, that were kind of doing crazy and talking about doing things that I did not have any belief that they could do. But when you take a step back and look at what people are looking for, you understand why that might be the case. So that's the first thing I'd always understand, and that helps you figure out if there is an alignment between what you're trying to achieve and what the investor is trying to achieve. And I think alignment is really important. It's not about understanding it so you can trick yourself into looking like the thing they're looking for. It's actually more about making sure that there is alignment between what they're looking for from the business and what you're looking for from the business. Because if not, you're just storing up problems for future. So that was one, not understanding enough. And I think you should just understand the venture math, the math behind a venture fund, if you're considering going that path. And then the second one is counterintuitive. And there are many people that have probably found the other side, but when fundraising, often and I've seen many other people do this, you kind of worry about leaving money on the table. You know, you want to tell people the maximum amount, you want to raise the maximum amount at the maximum valuation. Now, there's a whole reason why that's not what you should do, but we won't get into that right now. But once you start with that as, okay, what I want to do is negotiate the most competitive round I can, you worry about anchoring, you worry about starting too low. And we had various rounds where that fear led us to starting with a really high number, and then going out to market, and consequently not generating a competitive dynamic because we started too high, and then kind of having to go around with our tail between our legs, telling people actually we're raising a little bit less at a little bit of a less valuation, in an industry where actually people are looking for outliers, they're looking for things that generate excitement and momentum, and you're by definition showing them the opposite. Like that's not a good mechanic. And actually the opposite is a much smarter approach, which is to start lower than you think even you can achieve, such that everyone you talk to is getting really excited. Suddenly you have a really nice competitive dynamic and you're pushing things up. And like logically, the proof of that is, you know, if you start too high and you keep dropping until you only have one investor, well, by definition, you do not have a competitive dynamic. Whereas if you start too low and you have, you know, more than one investor, you already have a competitive dynamic to drive a much better outcome. And that was my learning. Like, better to start low, create a competitive dynamic and drive it up. And then everyone gets really excited about the thing they want to be in, rather than be the thing that the opposite.
And I want to ask you about the last question about GoCardless. At what point did you know that it's going to be a big business, and how did you tell?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think something interesting about it is our customers knew before we did. So there's a tweet. I always think you should give credit where credit's due. There's a tweet that before any of us ever thought this, before we were ever really anywhere, from a guy called Dwayne Jackson, who was one of our first partners who integrated our API. He built a business called Cashflow. Here's a really interesting backstory, actually. If anyone, you should go look him up and read about him. Really interesting guy. And he put a tweet out saying, like, putting it here first or whatever. And I'm sure the enterprising one, you can find it. Like, GoCardless will be a $1 billion company. So you can date that. And we all saw that, and we're like, I don't know what the hell Dwayne's smoking, but but he was right. And the reason is he saw the problem, he saw the need, because it was him and his customers. That was a long time before we did. And then the other thing I'd say that's interesting, that's an indirect answer, but I don't need to be too presumptive about success. We're doing really well, really happy with the business, etc. But something I've observed and learned over time is every business, in my experience, faces like an existential event every year of its existence, and they're just lucky if they realize. There's some really big businesses that are having one like right now. They don't even realize, and it'll be fine for a couple of years, but in like 3, 5, whatever many years, they're dead, and they haven't even realized. And it's the same in growth businesses, and you see this. Like, there are moments every year that if you get it right, then you unlock future growth, future potential, etc. If you get it wrong, if you miss the moment, if you didn't see where the opportunity was, you just killed it. So that's something I'm cognizant of in every business. You should never take anything for granted. It's all about continuing to provide an amazing product and service to your customers and creating a ton of value for them. And as markets change, as customers' needs change, like that can go away.
And as a second-time founder, what things did you change in your approach when launching Nested? And there is also this contrarian thing that usually people do exactly the opposite things that they did in the past, and usually those ones don't work either. So can you run us through some of those mistakes?
Yeah, that's an interesting phrasing of the question and somewhat correct. So I wouldn't say I did the opposite, but I definitely overcorrected. And I think there's a couple of things underlying this. The first one is, as you build a company, every stage of a company, your role changes. And this is the amazing thing about building a business. If you're a founder, your job literally changes, especially if we're growing like every 3 months, doing a completely different job. And suddenly, back to fun, learning, impact, it's so much fun, you're learning so much, and you feel like you're having a ton of impact. So that's amazing. But then if you fast forward, if you're building a business for, however many years, and your job's changing every 3 months, then you go back to start another business. Well, the job you were doing at the end is so drastically different to the one that you were doing at the beginning that there's, you don't even realize how much you've changed, and you have become a far better operator, a far better executive, far better manager, far better at all of these things, and it's sort of objectively true. But you have to understand that many of those things are not relevant. Like, they're for a different job. Like, you're great at a different job. Some of them are applicable, some of them are not. And that was one thing that I missed. And then that I didn't necessarily correct for sufficiently, I would say. And then the second side of the overcorrecting side is, I did look back hard at the initial stages and who I was in the initial stages, and the things you got wrong are the most obvious to you because they're the things that you took feedback for, they're the things that you felt yourself. And to your point, they may or may not, the alternative may or may not have been better. So I'll give you it's a really good but a really bad, dangerous example. First time out, like building GoCardless, I was a complete pain in the ass. Like as a manager, I didn't manage anyone before. Working with designers, I was a nightmare. Like with a designer, the brief generally is like, you should give a designer, a good, great designer, and we were really lucky with some fantastic designers in the early days with GoCardless and still today. You should give them a problem. You should go to a great designer with a problem, not a solution. That's the opposite of what I did. Like I went to them with like the exact solution of exactly what was required, and then they would go in and be like, no, this is what you need to do, which is terrible. And consequently, there are designers I worked with in the early days of GoCardless that hopefully would say, I think Matt's good and I think he's smart, I think he's whatever, but I wouldn't want to work with him again. So I was cognizant of that. And second around, I was like, okay, no, I've learned how to be a great manager. I've learned how to do all these things. I've learned how to like empower people to go and do amazing things. But in the early days, you are the person with the insight. You're the person who knows the whole business, who is so close to the customer, who knows everything. And actually, there's a real danger. If you get too far away from the solution, then it's going to be a weaker solution. And therefore, second time out, I empowered lots of people. I trusted them. I got good talent. I gave them whatever. But they didn't have the same drive. It's kind of impossible. They didn't have necessarily the same insight, the same relationship with the customer, etc. And as a result, the answer was worse. The experience is way better. They loved me. They thought I was an amazing manager. But we didn't get as good results. This is not a way of saying, like, I was right. That's not the point. The point here is that actually there is some that you've got to think about what you're optimizing for. And as a manager, much later in the business, where the vast majority of the output comes from the team, then you should be absolutely optimizing to create an amazing, empowering environment for amazing people where you can maximize that function. In the early days, when potentially the vast majority of the output can still come from like the key barrels and key people from within the business, then you should be optimizing to maximize the output that comes from those people. So those are a couple of thoughts.
How intentional were you about team culture in Nested, and how did you apply that?
Yeah, this is an interesting area, actually. We were incredibly intentional, but we didn't write it down. It was kind of, we operated by convention. And we had this, everything you do creates culture. So here's the example. Some people asked us about culture in the early days. And the thing I used to say, which is probably like no longer appropriate, but was like, we don't even, we don't even know we're going to be alive in 12 months. So like, why the fuck are we going to spend our time on this? Like, I'm spending all my time on making sure like I'm actually alive. And in a way, that's like not creating a culture because you're explicitly not writing anything down, explicitly not saying anything. But at the same time, that's an incredibly strong culture that you're creating, which is like, no, we're action-oriented. We want to get stuff done. We want to focus. And therefore, there are a number of those things that emerged in the way that we operated and the way we built that business, especially in the early days. And your culture is kind of the way you behave, times by the people you hire, times by the way that you onboard, manage, train, reward, motivate, hire, fire, promote, fire, times by events of what happens in the market, like this, some lazy formula. And that's what gives you like your dynamic culture. And there's another side, which is the deliberate side, where you can write it down and then try and like create that thing. So in GoCardless, we were very, we were not deliberate. We ended up with probably half of the culture we intended to. And then over time, there's a point where it got big enough that we realized we had probably, half that was not necessarily what we intended. And then that's a little bit of a painful process trying to get, once you're a living, breathing entity, trying to get, imagine me in this room trying to say, hey, everybody, let's try and find 5 values that we all believe are the right, or even 3 or 5 values that we all think are the absolute right core kernel things that we should be thinking about in everything we do all day. That's pretty difficult, especially when you signed up to something that you thought might have been slightly different, or the manager that hired you or the person you spoke to promised you something slightly different. So it'd be a little bit painful. Whereas in Nested, we took the opposite, which is even before I started, I had the values and I used them as basically as a lens for bringing people into the team. And that worked incredibly well. But again, sets a bit of a culture. It sets a slightly more thoughtful culture, which your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. If you're really thoughtful, then you might not be action-oriented enough. And there was a moment in that company where I had to go and we had them all up, the values up on the walls on like posters, and felt like we just got a little bit corporate, a little bit slow. And we literally went and like crossed one out, and just there was a big poster, beautiful poster printed by our designers. Designers must hate me. And I just crossed it out and just wrote bias to action on it because we just weren't getting enough stuff done. And again, like that, I didn't talk to anyone about that. It was just, I could just feel it. And, maybe I spoke to my founders. It was like, we got to make a change. And when you go and do that, when you go and cross something out in the middle of the office and like write on it and don't change that poster, like that sends a really clear message.
And at what point did you start investing? And how can you tell what's a good team or a good idea to invest in? Quite a few years ago now, I don't know. In fact, did it in 2 waves. I initially started investing a long time ago.
I don't know, eight to 10 years ago. But it was with a view that I knew that at some point I would want to angel invest. And I didn't want the time that I angel invested to be the time that I could not angel invest, i.e., I see the most amazing company founder investment and I want to invest. I didn't want that to be the first time because then I wouldn't know what I'm doing. And if that's the one where it really matters, if you get it right, then you don't want that to be the first time. So I intentionally went and wrote a couple of checks into interesting people or places and then stopped and just saw how I felt about those investments and what I learned over a couple of years. And it was like 3 investments was nothing. And that was amazing because I felt completely different afterwards. And I learned so much from doing it. And then I came back properly, I don't know, 6 years ago. A big part of why I invested was because the ecosystem has improved a lot from when we started, but there were still not that many people around that I found really, really useful. And I essentially wanted to be that angel that I'd wanted as a founder. That's really why I started. And part 1. Part 2 is because a friend of mine who's one of the smartest people I know, an astonishing person to work with, wanted to angel invest too. And he said to me, hey, why don't we do this together? I think we'll do way better, we'll learn way more, and we'll have way more fun. And I thought, yeah, that's great. And then part 3, because I find business incredibly fascinating, and I thought I'm gonna learn a ton from doing this. And then to your point on how do you distinguish on teams, I actually, again, I think differently to many people. I think that's way tougher than most people give credit. Like a lot of people think, especially when they're investing, think my job is to find the best possible founder, and they presume that they can do that. The challenge is that there are so many different founder archetypes. At some point, I should probably sit down and figure out what they are. But I think you can easily recognize the archetype you are yourself. So there's the product, there's the technical genius, there's the product visionary, there's the hard charging operator, there's the incredibly savvy commercial person, there's the industry expert. There's like the customer with the problem. There's all of these different archetypes, and the challenge is that what looks great in one, may be absent or the opposite in one of the others. So, and you saw this in investment a certain while back, where everybody was just investing in the same people that looked the same. It was all kind of same age, white, male, Oxford, or Oxbridge or Redbrook University, probably worked at McKinsey, Bain, Goldman, whatever, just getting all the investment. And it was because the people, they looked a lot like the people that were investing. So they looked.
The question is, did that work?
Yes, but probably not for the reasons it should have, which is if you want to make off-market returns, you need to go into uncommoditized asset classes. And I think angel investment was so uncommoditized at that time, there were so few people doing it, that the valuations were so low that with almost any hit rate, you could make really fantastic returns. That's kind of been driven up over time. Bringing back to the main point here is just, I think that with those different archetypes, if you start looking for this, super smart analytical operator, well, suddenly you miss the product visionary, and suddenly you miss all of these other archetypes. And actually, that is a phenomena that you notice in the industry. If you look at some of the biggest businesses to come out of Europe or globally, those founders found it incredibly difficult to raise early rounds of funding because they didn't necessarily look how people thought they would look, or didn't necessarily behave how people thought they would behave. So the short answer is I find it really difficult to assess people, and I do it with kind of a great deal of reticence and really try and, again, figure out, back to the things I said that people should think about with their own businesses, what is the founder market fit here? That's a lot easier than trying to figure out. It's okay, are they a fit for this market? Are they the right person? Do they have, even before I assess how strong that skill set is, do they have the right skill set for this opportunity, to have the right instincts for this market, et cetera? And, and then from working with them a little bit, you start to get a feel for, is this someone that I really want to work with?
And how does investing change between being an angel to being a VC?
It's much harder, is the honest answer. As a VC, you have to, as an angel, you're in a fortunate position where you don't have to compete with anyone. As I said, I wanted to be the kind of angel that I wanted as a founder. I can be your not necessarily your best friend, but I can just be completely candid with you. I don't have to compete with anyone, and therefore when a round comes around, Axel, Index, Sequoia, all the top funds have to fight with each other, and all will have a very strong win rate, but they've still got to compete with those. Whereas I can just sit back and whoever invests, I'm coming into. So you can get into all the best companies, which makes a huge difference. You also have a number of advantages in terms of the ability to sell secondary along the way. You don't have to continue to invest necessarily, which VCs do. Once you're committed to a business, you have to continue to support and do your pro rata, etc., which you need to factor in from the get-go. And also you have a completely different relationship. As a VC, you've got a lot of hard yards to do. Whatever I do, whenever I work with someone, I want to have a really, I always like want to be like net positive, right? So whatever my overhead is and whatever the value add I bring is, I want to make sure that's net positive for people. And as a VC, the challenge is you immediately do bring a level of overhead, right? And rightly so, because you're investing a lot of money. You need to take a board seat. You need to bring various things in. That means you have to work way harder to make sure that you're net positive in terms of the value you bring, and that's what the top firms do. They will work incredibly hard to do that and to bring their network to bear, to bring their experience to bear, in a number of ways. As an angel, the first thing to do to make yourself net positive is to make sure you have zero overhead, right? If you stay the hell out of the way when you're not needed, and then you're just there and really useful and really responsive when you are needed, you're already into a good position. And I obviously try to do far more than that, but it's much easier in many ways. And also you don't have to do all the tough stuff of, as a VC, you have LPs who it's incumbent on you to take very, very seriously. You have a responsibility to them to go and deliver returns. Whereas as an angel, your only responsibility is to yourself.
I want to ask a couple more questions and then do a Q&A for maybe 10 minutes. Being in Imperial, what should students work on?
Sorry, say that one more time.
What should students work on?
Like, honestly, whatever they want. My daughter, I tell her all the time, life's really easy. Everyone makes life way too hard. Okay, really easy. You want to be happy, you want to be successful. It's basically the same formula. Find stuff you're good at and you enjoy, because you'll love doing it, you'll want to do it, you'll invest your time, you'll get great at it, and that tends to be how you become successful and you enjoy yourself. So honestly, like, I wouldn't be too directive of like, oh, I want to do this and therefore I should go and do this course over here. Like, do the thing that you find genuinely fascinating. And give a really random example. I've always done a ton of sport and tried to stay fit, and in the gym you meet these people who are incredibly passionate about the gym and weightlifting and various other things, and they could tell you all sorts of stuff about the science behind building muscle, etc. And it always strikes me, like, I bet this person like hated, GCSE biology, but now some of the processes they're talking to me here, they have an unbelievable understanding, and it's because they found the passion, they found the way of unlocking this way of learning, that they're dealing with incredibly complex information because they're passionate about it, because they care, because they want to do it. And that for everyone here, like, and I had a recent experience of this when I intentionally went and did something to like build a skill set that I don't necessarily possess as much as I do, or not one of my key skill sets. And man, it was sucked. Like, I realized how much I like I'm really good at what I do, and I love doing it, and consequently I have fun every day, and I want to work, and I work incredibly hard. But spending like just a couple of weeks working on something that was not natural to me, that I was not very good at, and I did not enjoy, sucked. I got to the end of like each day, and I was delighted. It's like, God, thank God I don't have to do that anymore. And that's the opposite of how life should be. So honestly, like, find stuff you're good at and you enjoy, and life will be a joy, and you'll be incredibly successful.
And you advise your younger self on how to start a company. What's your advice?
I don't know. Honestly, you change one thing, you change everything. I've had such a good, fun ride. And I think it was really lucky, like more than smart, in figured out a few things early on, or was taught a few things early on from people that made all the difference. I think I got great, or like certain things my parents taught me in terms of how to behave and values and various other things that I think were great, and I'm really proud that I had those and they helped me do the right thing. And from my co-founders, from my jobs, I kind of figured out that actually the people make everything. You work with the right people, you become the average of the people that you surround yourself with, and you have amazing people, you can do amazing things, and I think that was important. And then there was one more thing that I got really lucky that I learned, and I think maybe I learned by accident. And actually, the person who taught me this, it transpires they don't actually subscribe to it, but it was an amazing lesson for me that's really stuck. Which is, so these are more things I don't know is the answer to that question. But what I can tell you, the things that I'm glad that I did learn, that I'm glad that I did do or get right, and they were all largely accidental. But one was like, life is not a zero-sum game. So many people treat life as a zero-sum game, and it's like, well, for me to win, they have to lose. And I just hate that way of thinking. And all my experience in building businesses was the opposite. Was actually like, if I can find a way for them to win, then I can probably win too, and maybe I can win bigger. And that even came down to negotiations with customers or big partners, hiring and working with people, everything. And it's also way more fun than trying to eliminate everyone. And then the other thing, and this is really risky, that we kind of got right, but you should be careful on listening to me on it, is we started a business really young that worked out very well for us. And it was great because it only gets harder over time. You have more responsibilities and more commitments. I'm quite careful with this advice though, because you've got to remember the vast majority of people who do this, it does not work out well necessarily. But what I would say is if you do want to start a business, I would just be cognizant of that it does, by definition, like I always think of like the science of the physics of the world and everything that surrounds you, right? And by definition, it gets harder over time to start a business. Everyone thinks it doesn't, but it does. As soon as you think about it for a second, it does. And therefore, if you really want to start something, there's an asymmetric risk in not doing so. And therefore, I would start at the earliest possible opportunity is one way to think about it. And then the other thing I learned later, that maybe this is what I would tell myself actually. Again, it's back to just thinking about the physics of things. In life, I love asymmetric upside, and I try and expose myself to that as much as possible. And I hate asymmetric downside, and I try to avoid it as much as possible. And it's why I don't do skydiving, because it's like, yeah, I'm sure that's great most of the time, but if that goes wrong, I'm dead. So, nah, I don't need that. Whereas in investment, like if I invest in a startup and if it goes wrong, I lose 1x my money. If it goes right, I can make 10x, 100x, 1000x my money. So I'm happy to take asymmetric, expose myself to asymmetric upside all day long. Asymmetric downside, no, thank you.
Do we have a microphone to the questions? Yes, super. Who has a question?
Thank you very much. So I wanted to first thank you for your insights, specifically your outlook on life about maximizing fun. I really do like hearing that from someone so successful. My question is mostly about something that I would want to do in the very near future, where I'm starting my own business as a B2B. And my plan is to go to my potential customer, sign the contract, get the pre-revenue, so get the money up front, use that money to set up my manufacturing facility, and then fulfill the contract at a later date. And my question is, what would you advise I consider when proposing this type of deal to my customers?
Very specific. If you can make it work, that's awesome. That's a fantastic way. A lot of people miss that one of the most important things in business is cash flow. Business is only as valuable as the cash flows it creates, and that's beautiful because you're lining everything up. Maybe a generic insight I would think about, and it really depends on the space you're in, so you've got to be a little bit careful here, but your early customers, I've always thought of them as icebergs. The bit they'll pay you is the bit above the water, and actually the bit below the water is far bigger, and that's where a lot of the value of your early customers comes from, which is credibility to get more customers, the feedback they give you about the product, the credibility they give you, like helping you build out your bug list, your product roadmap, etc. All of those things. So the one thing I just think about there is what you described sounded like a slightly transactional relationship, which we can achieve, and that works and makes sense, great. I might just think of it as a slightly more holistic relationship of actually there may be more to this than just getting the cash and the revenue, and I might be able to give a little bit more to get far more in the long run, would be the one thought. But again, it's very difficult with little context to say smart stuff, so apologies if I didn't.
Yeah.
Hi. Firstly, thank you very much. That was very insightful. I also think I have to give you some background info about myself because I'm actually not a student here. I'm a student at London College of Fashion, and I'm doing a entrepreneurial master's course as well. And my idea is to build a sustainable and solution-oriented underwear brand. And my question is really about the funding part, because as far as I know, it's a very male-dominated field still, and obviously you would probably be my customer when it comes to bras and solution-oriented underwear. So if I were in the situation of actually going into a funding round, how would I not lose you or your interest in funding my business, basically?
Good question.
Thank you.
I think people are open-minded. I think people are open-minded enough that it's not the case. If it's a good business and a well-communicated problem from a credible person, then you can invest in all sorts of stuff. Like if I look at my angel investment, I've invested in almost anything from really boring SaaS apps to subjects that I have no real knowledge of, but I've invested in menopause apps, right? I know very little about menopause, unsurprisingly. But I met an amazing person who really was passionate and driven, and I felt like they could do something special, and they had a unique or compelling insight as to what they were doing. So I think if those things are communicated, then you stand the best opportunity. That's the vague answer. And then the concrete answer is, the key is to make sure you're talking to the right person in the first place. So the thing that I would do is go and look at the kind of companies that you like and want to be like, and they're in a similar space, a similar geography, similar stage, similar approach. And I would look at who funded them. Because by definition, they funded this kind of thing before, so they're clearly interested in the area. Also, by definition, if that's a brand that you like and think is really cool, then probably they've been quite successful. So those people are going to be particularly receptive to those kinds of ideas. And having been involved in them, by definition, they'll probably also be that much more useful. So that would be the concrete thing I would do.
Cool. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks again for a very insightful talk. So everyone is talking about how to assess startups and founders for them to get funded. My question would be from the other side, how should we startups assess investors to have a really good investor-founder match, especially when we are talking about early stage investment? Thank you.
Yeah, really important area. So first thing is alignment between what you want to achieve and what the investor wants to achieve. Even two people who have completely aligned values and approaches, etc., if you have different goals, will have a problem. There's the Charlie Munger aphorism of, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. So that's the first thing I'd look at aligning. And then the second thing is the thing I said earlier of trust, respect. First off, find someone that you trust. Second, ideally someone that you like, because you've been working with them for a long time, and if they sap your energy every time you come across them, that's going to be extremely unhelpful. And then third, someone ideally that you respect and rate, and you think they bring some value to the endeavor.
Hi. So I feel like there are a lot of startups right now happening, but when you look at most of the deals, there's same few deals you see in the news, right? Same few deals being passed around by top VC firms. And I feel like this stage, I feel like the seed stage investments start to resemble kind of growth stage investments. The valuations are really high towards some of the AI companies are raising 100 million in their seed stages. Do you think the VC model is changing these days, or do you think it's just anomaly of the AI?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So it's definitely changed. It's definitely evolved. When I was first building GoCardless, we didn't know you could achieve these kind of outcomes as businesses. I remember when I was in YC, they were celebrating their best, I think it was to date, their best ever outcome. There was a company called Heroku that had sold for something like 170 million, and this was an astonishing thing. And it is amazing, and it's a cool company and a really cool product. But, well, now Y Combinator have companies, you know, that are considerably worth 100 billion. And when you change what the achievable outcome is, the exit price, that drastically changes what you'd be willing to pay as the entry price. So I think that's one thing that has changed over time. The second thing is that seeing, I mean, both from the ZERP and the interest rate phenomenon, it made the industry way more attractive. Lots more dollars came into it. We know what demand-supply curves, you know, we know what they look like. We know what happens when you shift one and the other, and that has certainly happened in the space. But, and I won't fully go through everything, but then a third thing I would just note is it can also be a lot more nuanced than that, which is certain businesses require a certain amount of capital. So, for example, people looked at foundational model companies that started and their first round would be $50 to $100 million, and we're saying, well, that's crazy. How can a company start and raise $50 to $100 million like when it's got nothing but a few founders? This makes no sense. But actually, if you're building a foundational model company, it makes even less sense for them to raise $10 to $20 million because they can't actually get anywhere with the capital. The first thing of an investment round is it should be designed to get the company to the next inflection point. And therefore, for certain businesses, actually, I think raising really large amounts of money where the conceivable upside or outcome is really huge, then it makes absolute sense that they should raise. But there definitely have been lots of, you know, high valuations, but that is a derivative of demand, it's a derivative of competition, and that creates those things. It's also an outcome of the industry, which is when you have lots of people fighting over few outlier companies, it can drive lots of ostensibly irrational, you know, if you take a VC fund, even with sensible pricing, if they're going to invest in 30, 35 companies, and they're going to make all their returns from 3 to 5 of them, well, then 30 of those were bad deals, right? So you look at that and say, well, 30 of those were terrible deals. They were overpriced. They paid too much for what they got out of it in the end. But then the other 5 were so theoretically underpriced that it paid for it. But in that world, you're looking at 30, and it's why I always laugh when the FT writes stuff about startups and growth or whatever, because they tear down, oh, they got it wrong on this 1, 2, 3, 4 occasions, but they fail to see that, well, in that example we just described, you know, that VC fund that makes all their money from 3, or you know, let's say it's 3, they just need a 10% hit rate to be right. So you can write 9 articles in the FT about how dumb they are, but as long as the one where they're smart, they're really, really smart, then it doesn't matter. And I think that is just an important nuance of those 2 are just interesting nuances to have. That being said, I largely agree with your push. But.
Let's do the last one. I think it's about time, correct?
Hi, Matt. So you mentioned initially that a good filter to have when you decide what to build is why you're the best person to build that thing at that given point. But you also mentioned when you started off first with GoCardless, you didn't really know what you were doing, and it's the first time you're probably playing in that market. So how did you justify that?
Yeah, so actually inadvertently. So it was true, but inadvertently true. Funny stories, we met a guy called Max Levchin who founded PayPal when we were starting GoCardless. And his main piece of advice was not to. Which is interesting when a titan of payment startups tells you that you should probably not do it, and you, knowing nothing, thinks you probably should. Turns out in probably this one case we were right and Max Levchin was wrong. But even a broken clock's right twice a day. The reasons that actually we were the right people were because we were the only people who were looking at this industry with a product-first perspective, and who were actually trying to build a way better product. You know, whereas everyone else was just thinking in commercial terms of everyone else was thinking how do we capture value, we think how do we create value, and we didn't know at the time, but that made us right. It meant that we built a far superior product to anyone else in the industry, and eventually we learned how to sell it. And then that meant that we became the number one in the industry. So it would have been even better if we were deliberate about that, right? And we came to the market and said, hey, everyone else in this market is coming at it with this perspective, and we're coming with this approach, and that's why we're going to win. We didn't. We got very lucky. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope there was something vaguely useful or interesting in there.
Thanks, Neeff.
We're going to take a short break now, before our next speaker, so 10 minutes. If you aren't planning on coming back into the room, we have a large number of people waiting outside, so if you could just let Nikki, who's just on the door, know that you won't be coming back so she can make sure those people get a seat, I would appreciate that. So we'll be back in here in just under 10 minutes.
Okay, guys. Guys, we're discussing outside. Can you show of hands how many people are founders here? Nice. And then how many people are students right now? It's like 50-50 maybe.
And how many people haven't started a business, but they would really like to start a business? Okay. And then last show of hands, how many people would like the idea of starting the business, but they're like fearful of starting a business? How many people are basically have started, think of starting, whatever, and are still fearful? That's okay. I'm fearful still too. It's okay. All right, thank you.
Super. For the third guest of today, we have George, who studied at Tufts, I believe, in MIT, and founded a number of companies, sold a number of companies. He started Golden Group until acquisition. He did eFood until acquisition as well from Delivery Hero, if you guys know them. Then did House Trip and sold to TripAdvisor. And now is the founder of Zoe, who is one of the most successful health companies around. Just a lot of companies, by the way.
There's probably more.
It's actually more. I didn't want to point out to all of them.
Actually, the first startup I started was a music festival in my high school. And we did it to raise money to educate universities around the world about a province of Greece that is called Macedonia. There was a naming dispute. Anyway, I won't go into the politics details. But anyway, we did that. And it was actually my first kind of foray into thinking about, oh, I like to build stuff and do stuff. So so I started early.
Super. Let's go to the founding story of Zoe. Can you walk us there, get us into your shoes?
Yeah. So it was the official date we incorporated Zoe is August 7th, 2017. And I had the idea of starting Zoe about a year before that. I just didn't know it. And what had happened was I had just sold both House Trip and eFood in the previous 2 years. And I decided for the first time in my life to actually take a sabbatical in order to just kind of decompress. Entrepreneurship is a hard journey, and maybe kind of think through what I do next. And in the very first week of the sabbatical, I took a trip together with a friend of mine with whom we had worked together at Yahoo, and then we talked with the idea of starting a business together, and he was going through a hard time on a personal basis, so we took a trip to Greece, actually to Crete. And that was the first week of my sabbatical, right? And during that trip, we started talking about food and nutrition, and for 5 days that we were in Crete, that was the only thing we were talking about, and part of the kind of the reason that we started talking about is that I had just gone and did my my blood test. And I found out I had a high cholesterol. I also did, at the recommendation of one of the doctors, what's called a DEXA scan to see what's happening inside my body. So DEXA scan shows the visceral fat, the internal fat you have in and around your organs. And I discovered that I was what they call a toffee. A toffee means thin outside, fat inside. So I had done that, and then I went to the lipid clinic in very close by here in Chelsea, on Fulham Road, Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, and the doctor, when I asked them to tell me what I should eat to be able to kind of manage my cholesterol, and my visceral fat, they gave me a leaflet from the British Heart Foundation. So I opened the leaflet, and then the first thing I saw in the leaflet was that I should not eat eggs. And suddenly, like at that moment, I vividly remember that I was in the clinic. The image of my grandmother popped up, and the image of my grandmother in our kitchen in Greece, in my house, telling me, "Hey George, don't eat kind of eggs. Don't eat more than 2 eggs. They're bad for your cholesterol." And I said, that cannot be true. And I said, that was like what my grandma was telling me like 40 years ago. And so I went and, had time and I started kind of searching. And the first thing I found, and it really kind of troubled me, was that the advice around eggs and cholesterol was based on just very, very few studies, okay? And like very small number of studies. And one of the most seminal studies, and that was quite shocking for me, was a study called the Ansel Keys study in 1972, which went kind of, a bit before than my grandmother's advice, right? And the Ansel Keys study took 12 people, okay? 12 people. They were all men, so basically representing just half the population of the world. Half of the 12 people, so 6, had high cholesterol levels already before the study started. Half of them did not. The study got these 12 people and said, all right, you're going to eat 4 eggs a day, and we're going to basically observe your cholesterol levels over the period of the next, I think it was 4 weeks or whatever. And at the same time, the study did not account for anything else these people were eating, drinking, or they're doing. So I said, like, okay, that doesn't sound right? Like 12 people, very poorly designed study, etc., just to basically come with an insight that then the whole world is using as basically the advice around eggs. So it got me thinking, and during that kind of trip with Jonathan, we start basically discussing about kind of how we had been doing things on the internet, and we're running basically millions of A/B tests or A/B tests on millions of points of data around figuring out kind of what wins and what works. And we said, all right, why are we relying on the data of 12 people in a poorly designed study to actually kind of give that kind of definitive advice around eggs and cholesterol? And again, you can multiply that for any food, any combination of food, etc. And why haven't we applied the same principles of the internet in collecting an enormous amount of data to be able to really understand what's happening with people, and then with the power of machine learning and AI, personalize it based on actually each individual kind of body and organism. So that was the genesis of that idea. It was basically based on a confusion around kind of what kind of I should be eating. Kind of personally, John had exactly the same confusion, and an insight that with the power of data, we can completely actually solve the problem of what is the right food for me individually to be healthier. We can basically solve that problem in a much more data-driven way, in a much more modern way. So that was basically the beginning of of the idea. Say, hey, there's a problem. We both have this problem, and possibly there's a way to solve this problem differently.
Well, my problem, George, is with your solution. You went after every conventional business advice, yes, which was launch early and get a product to the market. And on the contrary, you went and created the biggest study in the world in nutrition. Yes. How does this happen?
First of all, it's not clear yet whether we did the right thing or the wrong thing. So let me start by making that disclaimer. The reason we went basically that way, and just to give context and a bit more color to what kind of Kyriakos is saying, is that rather than start with a product, we said we're going to collect the largest data set in the world in the most scientifically advanced way in order to give the best advice possible. Best insight and best advice possible. And we took that call for multiple reasons that were important for us. It doesn't mean they were the right business reasons, but they were important for us. I think the first reason is that both Jonathan, my one co-founder, myself, and also our third co-founder, Tim Spector, we were at a stage of our lives. We're both I was 42 when I started Zoe. Tim, he's now 66 or 7. He was like around 60 maybe. Jonathan, 42 as well. We're at a stage of our lives that we had some success, number one. So we wanted to do something that mattered and it was like really robust. So actually, we cared more about doing the right thing. Also because we had had some success in the past and therefore kind of that mattered to us and we're older. The second thing is that because we had some success in the past, we were able to raise a lot of money to actually take that approach, right? And the third thing is that we took a view that, again, rightly or wrongly, because you can argue this both ways, that science is important both for us, so science matters for us in doing the right science, but also we took a view that in a world of fads, science will be important and increasingly important to more people going forward. Whether it will be important to the whole world or not, we didn't know, but we knew it's going to be important for at least a part of the world that was like us, and that part of the world will be increasingly larger. So that's why basically we said, rather than start and launch a product, and we had that debate very early in the company's timeline. I remember vividly, we were squatting with like a conference room at one of the VCs that we know in Golden Square, and that was before we started the company officially. And I remember us being on the whiteboard and articulating the two options we had. Option one was to go the way that we went, which is to do this huge clinical studies as the start of something that has become the largest clinical study in the world of this kind. Like we have like more than 300,000 people on it now. And option two was to launch a product that later on companies like Levels, etc. did. So actually the idea of Levels way before they did. That was the alternative option. And we said, no, we're going to go with the big data way and just go at it at the hard way, but what we felt is going to be the right way for the reasons I mentioned.
And you mentioned Tim, who's a third co-founder. How did you convince Tim to join you? And I believe in this room, like many people are wondering, how do you convince a scientist to join as a co-founder?
Yeah, so we got, first of all, I guess the TLDR, the key answer is like hustle, number one. And the second one is money. So kind of right just after that trip in Crete, somebody, because I was chatting about the nutrition thing, not to start a business, but chatting. Somebody recommended I read the book, The Diet Myth, which Tim Spector, my co-founder, had written, and in fact, I think it's probably his best book, and I highly recommend you read it. And so I got fascinated about that because it was the first time that I was introduced to this idea that we have this kind of trillions of bacteria in our gut, and that can be kind of quite more influential to many things around our health, our mood, and many other things. So anyway, I got very fascinated about this whole world and also about Tim. And then somebody mentioned his name. I said, I said, do you know him? And this person who became actually our first investor knew him, and he connected us with him. And I'm very, very grateful for this wonderful human being who did that. And so we went and saw Tim, and Tim is a very warm, is a lovely guy, but of course he meets these two kind of passionate entrepreneurs in his office at St. Thomas Hospital, and he says that publicly he thought he will never see us again. Because there are many people who actually have gone and pitched ideas to Tim, and then they disappeared. And so he told us, like, okay, if we could raise money for this, sounds cool, you sounds like credible, you seem like credible guys, etc. I said, fine, okay, we'll go and raise the money and we can do it. So that's what we did, basically. He actually, he trusted us, and also he saw the fact that we delivered after a few months in terms of raising the money, but all started because it came from a very warm introduction. And so if you can hustle to get a warm introduction to somebody like that, it always helps.
You made fundraising sound so easy. So can you give us some advice?
I mean, fundraising, has become easier because we've built companies, right? And that kind of plays a role. I would say for me, the biggest advice in terms of fundraising is think about what will be is getting basically in the other person's shoes. So I know Matt here was here before, like in getting into Matt's shoes, basically. Matt will never look at, or any investor will look at kind of a cold email. Most of them won't, right? So you can take that assumption. So think about, okay, who are people in Matt's network that basically, if I can get a warm introduction from, that I am somebody basically that kind of is credible and have all the kind of different kind of qualities of an entrepreneur, means that basically you'll be a hustler, you'll be resourceful, you'll be resilient, you really believe in this idea and you have something going for you on that. I don't subscribe to being the best in the world because you don't know that, and I don't like to compare myself to other people anyway. And I don't think people should anyway. So as long as you can basically find your way in terms of getting a warm, strong introduction that can represent you and say, hey, take that call because this person actually, like, I really believe in them. They want to actually really build something, and I would say that's kind of the key thing. The second thing, on which I agree with what Matt said before around aligned incentives, is that you need to be very clear around kind of what are the right types of investors for your company. I would argue that 99% of businesses are not the right businesses to go and raise venture capital for. My uncle has a pasta business in Greece. He never raised venture capital. It's a very nice business. He built over kind of 45, 50 years. He borrowed money from the bank, and now it's doing like a very significant volume. And he has another 2-3 competitors in Greece, still doing a very nice job. He's very profitable. So I think the second thing is that we're talking about kind of funding as this kind of mythical VC world, that basically we need to attract Excel, Index, and Sequoia from. And don't get me wrong, it's in their own best interest to actually popularize that narrative, because what they want is influx of people, right? But I would say for most entrepreneurs, that's the wrong capital, right? And I think being very clear around kind of what is the right capital for your business is a very, very important thing. And I would say that many times you know that from the very beginning. Like, for example, if I were to start a pasta business in Greece, definitely I wouldn't go to Matt to raise money for, But sometimes you don't know that, and you need like some starting capital, which you typically get from friends and family, and then you figure out along the way whether what is the profile of the company in terms of the asymmetry of risk and return that will kind of dictate what type of capital is the best one for you. So I would say that a very important thing is to really be brutally honest with yourself around what is the right capital, because as Matt said, again, it's about incentives. People who are in the venture capital want an asymmetric opportunity, which means that basically they invest a lot of money because then the returns can be humongous. But most businesses do not fit in that category, in my opinion.
And you went from the big study in aggregating a lot of information and then using that information. And I've rarely seen companies that actually, like, the usual rule is we need a lot of data and we're going to do something with that data. But like, most businesses don't do this correctly. So what have you done there? What was the first product, and how did you take advantage of all that information?
Yeah, so it's interesting to say that. So we raised our first round, which was, I think, something like $6 million, with 8 slides and 50 words. And rightly or wrongly, what we've said on those slides is exactly what we've done, which is also untypical, right? And again, we'll see how that plays out. But the whole idea and very conventional kind of approach was to use the clinical studies as an early version of our product. A very hacky, very time-consuming, very complex early version of our product, and then simplify the stats a bit more, simplify more, and then arrived at the kind of at the consumer product. So we had this idea about this consumer product from very early on. There's going to be a test we send at home. You do the test, right? We give you personalized insight and personalized advice. Basically, we can score any food for you. We give you a very simple tool, like a photo scanning app, to actually scan anything and understand what is the score of the food and what is right for you, and then to also give you personalized probiotics, right? That was our business. That was these 3 slides. I can show them to you, actually. There's one slide that says that's what Zoe is. And our first study, with the exception of probiotics that came later, our first study was a very complex way of doing that. What did it mean? It meant that basically we got 1,000 people, 700 of them twins, to come to the hospital for a day and be cannulated on a bed, and basically we measured their blood for basically 12 hours. Then send them at home with more testing to be doing, wearing a continuous glucose monitor for 14 days, and then doing 3 blood tests, but also doing like a gut test and another test, logging their food for 14 days, right? And then in the end, out of that, after about a year, get basically a PDF with some slides of results, and then a PDF with like some scores around the right foods for them. So that was our very first product, effectively, as part of the clinical study. And also, we used the clinical study as a way to recruit customers with a proposition, right? You'll discover basically based on...
So your go-to-market was actually through the study?
The go-to-market was basically recruiting people to the study as a way to understand what will resonate from a marketing perspective. Then they do this really intense kind of testing, like even at the hospital, and then we'll give them results in a very clunky way. As part of that, we're actually getting the feedback. Then we did the second study, which has basically the evolution of actually going from a hospital to being at home. So only at home. 14 days again, right? And then after that, we're able to launch the consumer product. But with all the learnings of the study and all the data that allow us to build the algorithm to actually make the predictions much better.
Was that the point that COVID hit?
Yeah, so just before we launched our commercial product, and we were planning to launch our commercial product when we was there in spring of 2020, COVID hit, and my co-founder Tim had this idea and said, and I'm sure most of you remember those days, like it was like dark, right? We didn't know what's happening in the world, everything was doom and gloom, people were dying, you didn't know how serious it was. In fact, you thought it was very, very, very serious. So he said, Tim comes with 10 ideas a day, right? And he says, should we do something to help here? And again, very kind of aligned with the principles we had with the beginning of the company, where we decided to go the hard way, but with all the right way around science, investing, etc. We said, all right, why not? Actually, this is one time where actually matters to really do something. So we launched this app to track basically symptoms and then connect them with what happens in terms of how you develop the disease and whether you die, etc. And the reason why we did that is because our original idea about Zoe was around, if you can use large-scale data from consumers, millions of consumers, then by basically using that data in a community citizen science approach, you can get more powerful personalized insights and advice to all these individuals. So we use exactly the same approach with COVID, and to our surprise, we built this up in 5 days, and it became viral. It got 5 million people in the UK using it, and it became the largest community science project in the world around COVID. I'll give you an insight. The anosmia, which is the lack of smell and taste, which is a core symptom of COVID, we proved with this study, scientifically, and published a paper in Nature Medicine after a few days, that it was the leading symptom of COVID, and that got a lot of governments then to actually make it a core symptom of COVID. So I'm sharing the story only to say that sometimes you say, I'm going to do something. I have no idea whether it's going to work. I think, but I have a good feeling about why I want to do it. Right? That's the insight I want to pass. and in our case, actually want to help, want to be there, kind of when it matters for people. And sometimes you don't know what's going to happen. In our case, actually, we never thought we were going to have 5 million people after, 10, 15 days using the app. And looking back, it's one of the probably the most wonderful things we've ever done in our lives.
And then these 5 million people that you mentioned, was it the second wave of customers, would you say, that were using the product?
Yeah, I mean, by doing that, again, you're doing something you don't know whether it's going to basically play out, and suddenly luck happens, and that meant that basically Zoe was a household name in the UK, and so when we launched our commercial product, we managed to effectively transition that trust from the COVID app to what we're doing around nutrition, because at the end of the day, the same underpinning was there, was basically real science, powered by the people for the people. So we managed to transfer that by doing the podcast and also launch the product, and that gave us a lot of basically awareness and credibility.
And at what point do you decide to create more product lines? I've seen lately, I was in a weight loss, I believe, and I've seen the new supplements that went out, which are very interesting because it's not powder or anything like this. So how do you think about product lines?
Yeah, so first of all, again, coming back to the original slides, we always had, from the very beginning, this idea of doing supplements for the gut based on the data and the insights. The reason why we went into that area, which was the original idea, but actually became way more kind of obvious to us as we went along, is that there is a very important kind of, and sad I would say, but real truth in terms of following advice on anything that's hard. And eating well, right? In the end, it's quite simple, right? One could follow the 7 words of Michael Pollan, right? And eat real food, mostly plants in moderation, and do well, right? That's the honest answer. But applying the advice on a consistent basis for human beings, it's hard, right? It's hard for me. Like, you go for a stretch of 4 months, and then, most people, 90% of the people, fall into kind of bad habits. So part of our thesis with Zoe was basically by changing the locus of control from the doctors and the system to the individual, and empowering the individual to really understand what's happening in their body from every food, we're able to actually motivate them more to actually keep that 4-month stretch for like 9 months and 10 months. But the reality is still 90% of people, they will fall off kind of the cliff, they will have bad habits, etc. So part of the idea of actually giving them this kind of whole food prebiotic is to help people by giving them simple solutions they can apply in the everyday life. Because at the end of the day, the more simple a solution is, the more easy it's for people to apply it.
I think you also have very interesting ideas about company culture. So how intentional were you about the team you're building at the beginning, and how did you do it?
Yeah, so we had like a number of failed attempts at company culture, I would say. And if I look back, I would say that I would probably score myself 5 out of 10 in terms of what we did, which is still very, very good, but I still believe there's so much more we could have done. So I would say the first insight is that culture is what you do, is not what you say. And the classic mistake we made in the beginning is we wrote our values. And you can write your values, and you can put them on the walls, and they can be simple, and they can be memorable. But if they're not specific enough in terms of the actual behaviors, right, then you'll fail. And I'll give you a classic example of a mistake we did and how we correct it afterwards. So with a value around customer obsession. I mean, it didn't mean anything. And I'll give you an example of why it didn't mean anything. And I remember in the very first days of us kind of launching a product, a team comes to me and says, George, with some good news and some bad news. I said, okay, tell me the bad news first. I said, we kind of, we sent kind of results to 69 customers that were wrong. I said, shit. Okay, tell me the good news. He says, we have to solve it. We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I asked them a simple question, which is, okay, who are these people? All right? In what part of the program they are? Kind of what age they are? What they're trying to solve in the health. And they said, oh, that's a great question, George. We don't know. Well, let's go back and actually figure it out. So that basically sparked the insight in my mind that although we're very intentional in terms of saying that actually we matter about caring about customers, we're not very prescriptive in terms of explaining to people what that truly meant in terms of the behavior they should actually exemplify on a day-to-day basis to make that happen. So we changed completely from a principles and aspirational values perspective of what we want to happen to actually to a behaviors values perspective, which actually what we celebrate as a behavior, and also as importantly, what we don't tolerate as a behavior. So for example, in this case, the value then kind of, where the value as kind of start basically with the customer, right? Understand their needs and work backwards to fulfill them. Which in that case was a very, very clear way of actually what the team could have done to actually solve the problem. So anyway, to cut a long short, we're very, very intentional about codifying that in behaviors afterwards. The mistake we did was that we had too many. So, and I would say that the different types of values, kind of, again, looking backwards, if I were to do them again, there's usually 2, 3 values, maybe 4 maximum, that can make a really big difference. And I would say just choosing on the 2 or 3 values that we're really going to prioritize on and specific behaviors around them is what I would do next time. And I think that will basically kind of really kind of determine kind of what company you like to be. I'll give you a very practical, simple example, which may not be right for everybody, but it will illustrate the point. There's this guy in the Valley called Frank Slutman. He wrote a book called Amp It Up. You know the book, right? He built basically 3 companies to more than $1 billion. And he has a very, very clear way in terms of basically what matters for him, which is about narrowing the focus, upping up the ante on the speed, and increasing basically the quality and the standards. And most people will tell you, oh, you need to compromise one of the 3. Because otherwise you cannot do it. And for him, actually, all 3 are important to happen at the same time. And these are the core operating behaviors he's celebrating. And for kind of, if somebody believed in that approach, like, I would say these are the 3 values. I would give like Frank Slutman's book to the people and said, okay, read this book, and if you don't like it, don't come and work here. So being very pointy and very simple about the operating behaviors and very specific, it's a good thing in the beginning because it allows you to actually be very, very clear. You may be right, you may be wrong, but be very clear about what you want to actually celebrate and what you don't tolerate. So that's what I will do next time.
Considering life expectancy, what would you suggest people do in their diets so they live longer?
Listen, I mean, there's a theoretical answer and then there's a practical answer. Theoretical answer is that kind of food is kind of the most important medicine. I really believe that. That's why we started the company. And being very intentional about kind of what you eat, for sure is going to increase your life expectancy. There's no question about it, right? And at the same time, it's hard, right? And at the same time, it's hard. And so I would say that if there are ways to help you eat the right food in the right way that make it easier, I'm much happier for people to do that versus not doing it at all. And the example I'm going to mention is Ozempic, right? About, I think, 8% or 10% now of the US is on Ozempic. Has single-handedly changed the curve on obesity. It's had like extremely powerful downstream effects around not only kind of diabetes, which is kind of course, the primary effect, but also cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. Of course, we need to let it run basically kind of a few more years to see basically the full picture. It has some side effects, about 6% of people. But if that helps a lot of people eat better, and in many cases, actually, people change their eating habits. A lot of people, 45% of people take Ozempic, exercise more or start exercising. And there's a very simple reason why. If you are, and I have people in my family who are like that, if you are basically in the extreme obesity level, there's a lot of other issues coming with that, including mental and psychological issues. So if by taking this drug, people, kind of control their appetite, eat on average better than they would have eaten otherwise, start exercising and finding hope in life, that's a great thing. That increases life expectancy. The reason I'm giving this answer is because based on the company I started, you expect me to say, hey, let's get everybody to eat better, and that would be the right thing to do. And I would say yes. And right, there are pragmatic solutions that for people that would have found it hard to actually do that, they can find actually renewed hope, better health in their life, etc. So be it. That's great.
You also invested early in some crazy companies. So how do you find investments, and then how do you judge good teams?
So the reason I've been lucky with my investments is because I never set out to be an investor, and that's a very important constraint that has helped me to do one thing. So one of the rules that I keep using now in my life about many things, or most things in life, from hiring to pursuing an idea to pursuing an investment, is that I say, if it's not hell yeah, it's a no. If it's not hell yeah, it's a no. So by having the constraint of not being an investor, what you basically eliminate is the need to make an investment. So if you're an investor, basically you have like, I need to find the investment, I need to find an investment, right? Now, if you don't have that pressure on you, then you have the reverse psychology, which is like, if I see something, I say like, fuck, that's like so great, boom, I'll invest. And that's how I invest it. It's because I don't have the pressure to invest. If I see something and I'm saying, you know what, that's like super interesting, I'll go for it. That's how it has happened. Now, there's a counter argument to that, which is that people like mine may tell you, hey, you need to basically kind of spread your investments, and particularly in angel investment, to see like a lot of different things and invest in many different things. And probably that's right. Right? But in my case, because I have this kind of constraint that allows me to only kind of write checks when I say hell yeah, that has served me well so far.
I wanted to ask you.
I would say the hell yeah heuristic. I would say I would in general. I don't like to give advice, but for me at least, is a life lesson in terms of, if you can try to put constraints in your decision making, right, that would allow you to actually be very clear whether you're hell yeah or not, and then kind of act on that, meaning basically don't hire somebody if you're not hell yeah, that actually will help you a lot. That has helped me a lot for sure.
What would you advise people here to work on?
First of all, I don't think I can advise anybody what to work on. I think the only thing I can listen. My biggest learning is hit the ball a lot. That's my biggest learning, and And the reason I'm saying that is that action produces information. People will tell you, oh, fine, what are you the best in the world at? I mean, I have no clue what I'm in the best world at, right? And why do you basically need to compare, right? But, but by hitting the ball a lot, you at least understand what you like, right? And also what you feel an affinity, and you're excited, and you want to spend all the time working, or not. And that's a valuable signal, right, in terms of basically on what to do. But I would say to figure that, you need to hit the ball a lot. And hitting a ball a lot is an interesting idea that is very much antithetical to what we've been taught in life. In life, we've been taught that, you know what, you need to be successful, or otherwise you're a failure. And I was reading this autobiography over Christmas about a famous basketball coach in Greece, Panagiotis Giannakis. And of course, like, kind of people have this kind of stereotype that he's been a very successful basketball player and coach. But if you look at his kind of biography, he's hit the ball 20 times. And I can tell you, kind of, we only remember maybe like the 2 or 3 times he's been successful, but he's been, quote unquote, unsuccessful 17 times. And he's been fired from teams, and he kind of like, did mistakes, etc. And I would say, but what matters is about hitting the ball a lot. It's about hitting the ball 17 times, and it doesn't matter, like, kind of whether it succeeds or fails in the conventional ways. What matters is producing information that helps you then focus on kind of something closer to what you enjoy and what you love. There's a very famous, actually very interesting press conference that another Greek guy in basketball, Giannis Antetokounmpo, the Greek freak, did after the kind of their kind of loss in the NBA finals, in the NBA playoffs 2 years ago. When people ask him, kind of, how do you feel that this season was a failure? And he says, like, that's the wrong question, right? Is it a failure? Like, you tell me that basically that, like the 15 years that kind of Michael Jordan played and didn't win championships was a failure? No, that's part of the game. You're trying and you keep going. So my point is, like, if there's only one piece of advice and insight, is like, just act and do shit and forget about kind of the notion of failure or success. Because at the end of the day, by doing things, it will get you one step closer in understanding what you like and what you're good at, maybe, and then you have an affinity with. And for me, that's always a success.
Have you heard about the founder mode from Paul Graham lately?
Yes.
What's your take on it?
So, first of all, there's 1,000 different ways to run a company, as there's 1,000 different ways of being smart, in my opinion. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. That's the first point. The second point is that if you look at it kind of mechanistically in terms of the different kind of ways of building a business and in terms of the time invested towards actually doing something of essence, productive, impactful, does it make sense? The answer is yes, it does make sense, right? Like, it resonated with me. Like, I hate kind of bullshit meetings. I hate kind of I believe that typically founders bring a different kind of mode to a company. They're the energizer buddies. They build a different level of passion and intensity. And if you want to maximize the success of something, it's probably kind of has a higher chance of doing that. Does it apply for everybody and every founder? I would say no, right? So you need to know basically, first of all, whether you're comfortable applying that, right? Can you build a company that's successful without being in founder mode? Yes. So I would say being in founder mode has many different shades of gray. And it needs to feel something authentic and natural to you if you want to actually do it. If you take to the extreme, for people who can apply to the extreme, can they be on average more successful? I would say probably yes. But I think for people to apply it, it needs to feel natural to them and applied at the right kind of intensity or not.
And for my last
question, what do you
think?
think?
What do I think about founder modes? I think there is a lot of advice out there that is bullshit advice. And one of them is the classic startup advice you get at the beginning is go and hire a number of VPs, like get a chief, a CTO, get a VP of sales, a VP of marketing, and so on. I think that's the exact wrong advice that founder mode hit a nail on. Because usually people just go and hire a number of executives, and then the executives don't do the work, so then they want to invite, they want to bring to the company many, many more folks to work under them. And what ends up happening is like you have an extremely expensive business to run with no results. And my view, like my philosophy about this is much more closer to how Leonidas was running the 300s, which is if you are running a battalion or if you are running into a fight, you should be the first in the line. So the leader should be in the first in line, they should be the first that dies.
I would agree, and I think another thing to build on that is that one way to think about founder mode in a different way is to go and hire many founders in your team. And founders can come again in many different kind of ways, shapes, and forms. They don't need to be kind of, necessarily tech founders. They can be like a community founder or something else, right? That's important.
Last question. You're giving startup advice to your younger self. What is it?
Listen, at the end of the day, and that's why I asked the question about fear. I would say the kind of one of the most unspoken things in life that is probably prevalent on kind of 9 or 10 billion or how many people we have in the world now. Almost every single day is fear and the relationship with fear. And it's something that's not spoken about, right? Because fear is terrifying. It's paralyzing, right? And fear has two daughters. Daughter one is paralysis and inaction, and daughter two is action. And the whole bet is how do you actually are able to be in the action mode and not in the paralysis mode, right? Because eliminating fear is impossible. Everybody has fear. So if there was only one thing that I would hope for my children to have is to be able to have a conversation with fear, right? And in that conversation, rather than put fear on the driving wheel on the bus, and my daughters to be like the passengers, is to be the other way around. Is to say, hey, fear, I hear you, I see you, we're together. Now just go and sit on the back of the bus and let me drive.
Incredible. With that, can we have a couple of questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Georgia, I'm a really big fan actually of Zoe. I actually do my own nutritional studies with myself, so it's not clinical at all. But what does the future look like for Zoe? For example, I see you're wearing an Oru, I'm guessing, like integrating your data into wearables.
Yeah, listen, I think the future of Zoe is on two axes that are all about how can you actually make our advice kind of simple and accessible by more people, and how can we make our solutions simple and accessible by more people. Let me give you an example. It's not something I'm saying we're working on, but let me give you an example of how the future could look like. So I was showing Kyriakos before the meta glasses. I don't know if people have wear the glasses. So my view of the world is we're moving to a world that at least one of the dominant interfaces will be vision and voice and sound. All right. So imagine you're wearing these glasses, and the glasses can see everything you eat. Right? It will happen, right? Because if your eyes can see what you put in your mouth, then your glasses can see what you put in your mouth, right? So one example of that future is that rather than having to log food or to scan a menu or kind of think about food, is that you're going to be wearing glasses, and they'll tell me, "Hey, George, okay, it was like not a great day today. You're already at 2,000 calories, and your score is 35. Maybe just kind of take it easy for the rest of the day, and maybe think about kind of not eating for the next 3 hours before you go to bed, so you can have a better sleep, and tomorrow is a better day." So that idea of basically of when we originally conceived kind of Zoe, Zoe means life in Greek, right? And there was this idea about this kind of personal AI nutritionist in your pocket, right? And that is where I think the future is going on that dimension, is basically is through this kind of new dominant kind of interface like voice and vision, things are going to start becoming kind of more and more and more effortless.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, you've been in a bit of a privileged situation because you had companies before and you were able to get that funding quite quickly for a science-based product and vision. For those of us who aren't in that privileged position, science produces its own regulatory issues that can end up, or the product can end up in the graveyard before it even becomes feasible. So what advice would you give to us who are trying to bootstrap that period where we're trying to get the product to launch, but we need to produce feasibility studies to say, hey, it is effective and it's going to work, it's safe, and it's not going to kill anyone?
So it's very difficult to give advice on abstract in terms of these, but there's always different ways to go about it. So one example is that let's say that you cannot raise money to do kind of whatever you need to do the scientific studies to prove the efficacy and the validity or the safety, whatever that is, right? So I would ask myself the question, right? What do I need to basically kind of prove to an investor, right? What are the kind of the smaller steps in order to be able to get them to actually at least invest in kind of in a phase or etc. So it could be, for example, that you go and test the product with like a dummy product and see that actually how much interest there is in terms of customers, in terms of solving a problem, etc. So for example, what I've done with other startups is before you even launch a product, you start running ads or you ask customers to buy a product, which is like a fake product, just to test basically the interest. So are you solving, is your product solving something that when you deliver it, it's going to have a lot of demand. So that's one thing, right? The second one is, let's say that even that is not enough to actually get somebody to invest in the studies to be able to prove the safety, right? All right, can you run gather some other data and run a simulation to show that actually, based on a simulation, right, and some data, which is a smaller amount of data, you predict that your product actually will have the right kind of efficacy and the right safety. So I would basically kind of try to kind of put it in chunks that can give basically an investor some comfort that's either investing the whole thing is worthwhile because there'll be a return, or is kind of de-risked, or I will chunk it in smaller phases to basically be able to kind of invest for the next inflection point and then the next inflection point. But in the end, you will need basically some kind of to show some belief that is this a product that people actually will buy, right? Is this a solution that based on either data, simulations, a scientist, something that actually can be delivered, and is that kind of de-risked to be able to actually to raise some funding?
Hi, thank you, George. We've talked a lot today about product, hiring, and funding, but one component that has been missing a bit is go-to-market and sales. So I was wondering, could you give some advice on figuring out the right go-to-market strategy for a new startup?
Again, very difficult to give advice kind of on abstract because there's so many different types of startups. You know, first of all, is it a consumer startup or is it like a business-to-business startup? But at the end of the day, I think for me, the way I would figure out any go-to-market strategy is to really go out and talk to customers, right? And I think by talking to customers, first of all, you you understand really kind of what's the right kind of pitch and the right positioning, and you're going to iterate that multiple times. You understand, how much competition there is, what you're competing basically against to grab their attention. One framework that I've always loved using is the jobs to be done framework, which was, how many people know about jobs to be done? All right, okay, so jobs to be done is a framework that was invented by two guys, Bob Moesta and Clayton Christensen. There's a book called Demand Side Sales that I would advise people to read or watch the video around. But the whole fundamental premise of demand side sales and jobs to be done is that sales is not selling, okay? Sales is helping somebody make the progress they want to make in their lives. So basically, and they talk about taking this kind of customer view, that's why they say demand side sales, not supply side sales. So I'm not selling to you, I'm trying to understand what is the progress you're trying to make, and I insert myself basically because I'm the best kind of way for you to make progress. And the way that they advise in figuring that out, which could be an interesting kind of thing to consider, is that is to do a lot of kind of demand side sales interviews for people who could be interested or ideally have bought maybe your product or a type of similar product. And you do what's called demand side sales interview, where you sit down with that customer and you map a timeline of basically around that particular topic, kind of, a timeline of exactly what's happened in their lives over the last kind of 2-3 years, and the different points where they thought, oh, I need to make a change and make progress, and all the way down to the point where they decide to buy a solution or something. And by mapping that, you figure out what's the best way to kind of insert from a positioning perspective your product in this customer's lives, but also what would it take to actually convince this person to actually use your product to make progress. So I would recommend you read that demand side sales or watch any videos online. I think it's very, very helpful to do interviews and figure out go-to-market.
Hi, George. I'm Greek as well, so Kyriakos, thank you as well. Speaking of go-to-market, I have a question around how you guys managed to get all of this success story in the UK, because in the UK, I mean, people are very sick in terms of their health span. So although we live longer, we spend the last 20 years of our lives with a chronic disease. So my question is, people are not very proactive when it comes to their health. So how did you manage to educate users initially to come up with their nutrition and testing and looking at their gut microbiome and all of these things?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that Zoe is probably the first company I started, not the first, but one of the very few companies that suddenly it becomes like the center of conversation for every dinner party I'm going to. And for me, that showed very early on that we hit a nerve because it's something that food is something that we probably do for 60% of our kind of non-sleeping lives. Like thinking about, okay, how many hours do you spend in terms of like preparing food, kind of eating food, cleaning, kind of shopping, thinking about it, etc. So first of all, something that's actually, regardless of whether people are officially kind of obsessed about being proactive about the health, it's something that is really top of mind on people's lives, right? So that's the first thing, that it was a kind of very ripe as kind of an area. The second thing is that we were lucky because we launched the COVID app, and that really propelled us into accidentally to kind of millions and millions of people kind of knowing us and trusting us. So when we actually then launched our podcast, which was a way to actually give this kind of great nutritional advice, scientific nutritional advice, free to the world, that was met basically with a lot of demand, because people are fundamentally interested. It's something that people talk about all the time, right? And so it was a confluence of these two things: an interest that is there in people's minds, and also us being kind of lucky to actually get some kind of awareness because of the COVID app, and then actually transferring that into a subject that's so interesting in people's lives.
One more thing, like, did you find a specific demographic being more interested into this?
We spent so much time, I think, about, okay, what's the right demographics? So we focus on one, etc., because everybody's interested in food and everybody's interested in health in some way, shape, or form. The answer is no, right? Although I have to say, if I were to single out a particular kind of segment, is people around the ages around 40 to 60, and the reason for that segment for us is that this is typically the time where, and that holds true for my generation. I think the younger generation is actually more proactive about health, I would say, based on what I see. But for my generation, when you start going to that age of 40, 50, 60, you start thinking about things that you haven't thought about in the past way more. And the reason is because you're getting older and like there's less of life ahead for you, and therefore you want to take basically better care to actually to live a healthier life. So we found basically kind of a demographic there that was quite, I would say, more interested. That's our core demographic. But it's been a challenge because it's a proposition that can apply to so many people because everybody's interested in.
Can we do last question? Maybe there.
Hi. So as founders, there is a lot of information around and there is a lot of advice. And there's more of generic advice that think and make a decision, but nobody really teaches how to think. Apart from that, end of the day, the founder is making all the decisions, which means sometimes there's a lot of pressure that the stakes are really high. So how much should I be delegating? What should I be delegating? So how do we make effective decisions and also kind of get some of the pressure off while we are making very big decisions, which could feel like the stakes are really high?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, there's like, kind of millions of decisions that that a founder has to make in the lifetime of a company, right? And the first thing is that I think be very clear kind of the type of decision that basically kind of you're called to make, and then spend kind of the appropriate time. So basically there's like, two-way door decisions, which means that like, okay, you can always reverse it. So basically, typically for those decisions, just be faster. And there's like, decisions that are one-way door decisions, which means that basically you really need to think through about kind of what do you do. Like, for example, like, if you're going to go fully remote as a company or not, it's a one-way door decision. It's very difficult to reverse. I mean, it is reversible, but it's hard to reverse. That makes sense. So I think that's one axis, and the other axis around kind of the risk profile in terms of upside and downside. I think Matt talked about asymmetric or symmetric risk on the upside or the downside. So first of all, think about what type of decision you're trying to make, and again, the smaller kind of the asymmetry and kind of the more two-way door decision, the less time you spend, because at the end of the day, it's kind of very, very kind of reversible. Then the second thing is that I would say that every kind of decision, a good practice to do is to have an alternative, or to think about an alternative. And the way, I'll tell you the way I do it, I'm not saying it's right, is that let's put two options together, and rather than try to debate whether my option is better than yours, right? Let's work as a team and say, okay, we'll take option one and we'll try to make it as great as it can be. Then we'll put it on the side. Then we'll take option two, and then we'll try again to make it as great as it can be, and then we'll take a decision, right? And so that was my second heuristic around, create every great strategy needs an alternative strategy, and try to make the best out of it and then basically make a call. The third thing is that in most decisions, in my opinion, at least the important ones around hiring, etc., if it's not a hell yeah, it's a no. Right? And that's a decision. And then the last thing is, you're going to get a lot of advice, but you're responsible for the advice you get. So any decision is the right decision as long as it's your decision.
Makes sense. And just a follow-up. Sorry, a follow-up. So there's always new information that's coming in with any choice that we make. Also, when I'm making a choice between option one and option two, there's a constant addition of new information. So how do we know it's the right time and the optimal time frame for making any decision?
So you're saying you made a decision, new information comes in.
Yeah, that keeps coming in.
Yeah, I think that, again, goes back to fear, basically, because the biggest fear you have is that, I have now new information, right? And should that change my original decision, or should I keep going, right? And I would say that if it's very clear to you, listen, first of all, you make a decision, you go for it, and you stick with it. You don't actually second guess it. But then if information comes in that says actually that was the wrong decision, the biggest challenge you have is actually overcoming your fear and putting your fear in the back seat to actually reverse the decision. But that's how I would think about it. But you need to be very clear that the new information is actually telling you that actually you need to reverse the decision. And I would say that there's one company that we could have had a much better outcome, and the reason we didn't have a better outcome is that I made a mistake in not pivoting the company. It was good, it was doing well, but if we had pivoted the company, it would have actually been a much better outcome. And the biggest kind of reason why I didn't pivot the company, it was fear. I didn't have the courage to do it. Okay, so I think my insight out of that is basically you need to be very, very clear in terms of that kind of trade-off, and very clear why you're not going for something kind of bigger or better, and then take the decision. But usually there will always be some fear in any big decision, and you need to be basically comfortable with that.
George, thank you for the inspirational discussion, and thanks everyone for coming.
Good luck.